Hey, government students. Today we're going to continue our talk with about the executive branch. In particular, we're going to focus on these different bureaucratic structures and agencies that make up that executive branch and carry out the function of the law. So before we get into the different cabinets and agencies, the main thing to understand about the bureaucracy is that it is going to be made up of people who surround the president and help him to execute the law and carry out those laws that Congress passes. Because if you remember, the executive branch's main job is to enforce these laws. Laws are all well and good, but if they're not enforced, then they don't do much good. And so this starts off with at the very top with the president's inner circle. These are the people that he talks with on the day-to-day basis and help him to make policy decisions, help him to guide him in these different specific areas. The main person in charge of being his right-hand man, so to speak, is going to be his chief of staff. And this is going to be the leader of the WHO or the White House office, or the people that work in the West Wing of the White House itself that basically help the president carry out his day-to-day tasks. That chief of staff is going to be his chief strategist. It's going to be the person who helps him make those important decisions. It's important to note that the people in his inner circle, both the WHO and the EOP, which I'll mention in a minute, are made up of close personal members who do not need Senate approval. These are basically just personal advisors of the president and help him to carry out those tasks. So in addition to his chief of staff, you may have seen oftentimes in the news his press secretary, who's in charge of dealing with the media and being his spokesperson, basically his mouthpiece for how he wants to get his message out there, how he wants to respond to any national events. And this person is oftentimes very important, oftentimes changes with each, not only each president, but within each presidency. There oftentimes is heavy turnover at this position. It's a very stressful job because you have to imagine these are very tough issues that they have to deal with. You have to say the exact right thing, and people scrutinize your every word. So this is an important person for the president to have and someone in experience with that position. In addition, he has many other people who counsel him and are experts in certain areas that don't necessarily have any formal powers of carrying out the law, but are just generally speaking advisors that help the president make decisions on different policies that he's dealing with at the time. And so oftentimes these are experts in different fields, whether it's like the press secretaries, generally speaking, obviously in charge of the media, but there's many other people that help him to make decisions on monetary policy, military policy, things of that nature. These positions, in addition to those in the White House office itself, also include advisors in what we call the Executive Office of the President, or the EOP. This includes many advisors that have special backgrounds in certain policy areas like fiscal policy, monetary policy. Maybe their backgrounds in taxation or dealing with businesses. And so if the president wanted advisement in one of those areas, he would consult with his Office of Monetary and Budget Control. And these members, along with others, are going to be the ones helping shape the policy. Because you have to remember that all presidents are not experts in every single field. And so what they need are to surround themselves with people that they feel comfortable with and trust as experts to help them make those decisions. In addition to the monetary one, you also have the National Security Council, which is a formal group made up of top level executives from the different areas of the executive branch. Obviously, the president is the head of it as the commander-in-chief, but it also includes the vice president, secretaries of state, secretary of defense, homeland security, as well as the joint chiefs of staff of the Army, Navy, Air Force, etc., the CIA. All these people come together in what you can see here are top-level positions that meet and discuss national security. So they are supposed to meet regularly with the president to keep them up to date on what's going on as far as threats within the country, et cetera, and make sure that they help them to make those top level decisions. Because at the end of the day, being commander in chief, the president gets the final say so in those decisions. But it's important to be fully aware and informed before he does so. So that's the job of the National Security Council. Again, all of these positions that we just mentioned are mostly advisement roles and do not need Senate approval, unlike these next different groups that we're going to speak of. All right. So the way the executive branch is set up, you have the president. It's hierarchical, where you have the president at the top, and the people below him help him to carry out and execute these laws. The president is only one person, so it's tough to try to carry out all these different laws that Congress has passed in the throughout history and today, and enforce all these laws. So what they did, and originally from George Washington down, is delegated power to these different agencies to carry them out. And that way, that it gets carried out efficiently and effectively, and you can hire experts in these different fields that we'll take a look at more so in just a minute. It was not originally as large as it is today. It has grown immensely. It started off with 4 cabinet positions, such as Secretary of State and Secretary of War, and have changed over the course of time to include all of these different departments. So at the very top level, again, it's set up in a hierarchical structure. At the very top level, you're going to have cabinet positions. These are high-level positions in the different agencies like you see here. But these, again, have not always been there. They've started off with 4 positions, as I mentioned earlier, and after historical developments have occurred, there arose a need, such as the most recent example is the Department of Homeland Security arose after the 9/11 terrorist attack. So in 2002, it was the most recent cabinet level position that was created. And so these arise oftentimes out of actual issues or problems, and is at the discretion of Congress and the president to decide whether or not to create a new cabinet agency or cabinet department, that is. Their duties include not only advising the president. These are going to be policy experts in international relations, like Secretary of State, or could be, obviously an expert in the field of agriculture that advises the president and other people involved in the executive branch of how to carry out this law. And they also do the function of carrying out and making rules of how to implement the law. All right, for example, your Secretary of Education, the leader of that cabinet department, is going to create rules and instructions for how to carry out the laws that Congress passes and make sure that they get enforced and implemented to the law, the letter of the law. Now, we're going to talk about this later, but more or less they have some leeway, some discretion in how they carry out the law, especially if the law is vague and open to interpretation. It's up to them to decide how to implement that effectively. These cabinet secretaries, by the way, the secretary is the name for the position, the leader of that cabinet position. They are chosen by the president, and they do have to go through Senate approval. All right, and so this is one of those presidential appointments. That's one of his formal powers in the Constitution. But typically, what we see as cabinet secretaries are going to be some type of close, personal relationship with the president, or some type of background. They've worked with him in the past. For example, you can take a look at President Obama's Secretary of Education during his tenure in office was actually the superintendent of Chicago schools, where he was originally from at that time. So you can see this often in many areas, like President Trump named a lot of his cabinet positions based on the contacts and people he knew in New York as a financier or on Wall Street. And so the reason why they do this, though, is to make sure that they have similar mindsets, ideologies as themselves, because these are people that they're going to delegate tasks to and make sure that they carry out the law appropriately. And so you want to have somebody in that position that is going to basically do more or less the job that you would do had you had that position. All right. And so because the president is one person, he needs to surround himself with people that would carry out the law in a similar manner. And so these cabinet level secretaries are the leaders of their department and can implement these laws at their own discretion. And so a lot of them are going to be ideologically and politically similar to the president. So if the president is a Republican or a Democrat, oftentimes they'll have similar mindsets, at least, even if they're not exactly the same. But they'll be their tendencies are going to be similar to that of the president. So the way a typical bureaucratic cabinet position or the structure of the entire department is laid out is you have the president at the top, then you have your cabinet level department like the Treasury Department, and then underneath those departments, by the way, the department is led by that cabinet secretary. So the Secretary of Treasury leads the whole department, and then they are made up of different agencies that fall under that cabinet position. All right. For example, you're going to have different, offices that deal with, the money system itself. So our IRS collects the taxes. The Mint, of course, makes the different, monetary systems that we have in terms of like dollar bills and coins and things of that nature. These different level agencies, though, have specific tasks, but they answer to that particular cabinet secretary. So in this way, we can delegate tasks and assign different roles. And so in the same way that we have committees that makes passing laws go by faster, if we delegate certain tasks to these different agencies, it makes the overall process of bureaucracy more streamlined, more efficient is the idea. All right, so I want to talk about a couple of the key agencies within the departments that we need to know about. That is going to be your major agencies like Homeland Security. A good example would be the Coast Guard. Protecting Homeland Security would fall under their jurisdiction. It was moved to that one after 2002, like I mentioned, when it was created. The Department of Justice, all right, what you would think of as the justice system, is going to be different agencies that enforce the criminal laws, such as the FBI, Drug Enforcement Agency, DEA, the Treasury we mentioned earlier. The IRS would be an agency within that cabinet department. Secretary of Defense leads the Defense Department. It's going to be all your different military branches, Army, Navy, etc., the National Security Advisement, and then also the our National Security Agency. And then, of course, you have different other departments that you can see here. But make sure you know some of these key agencies and the structure of the department. All right. So there are different types of agencies as well. So there's a lot of different ones that we've talked about just now, but we can sort them into different groups based on what they do. And it's important to understand, and this is sometimes a difficult concept for students to understand, so make sure that you are familiar with and can come up with examples of each of these different types. All right, so the first being independent executive agencies. These are going to be agencies that are not necessarily under the function of any of these different cabinet departments. They're independent, and their job is to carry out the laws in such a way that is non-political. So a good example of an independent executive agency, again, it's supposed to be non-political, would be like NASA. It's run by the government, it's funded by the government, but does not necessarily need to be political. It exists in its own realm, doesn't really fall under any of the other cabinet agencies. And, more or less the idea is to give them some more autonomy or freedom to do what it is that they do. Now, the way they mostly are controlled, they have a board, they have a single head member. So the president does have discretion to appoint those people, but Congress also gets to decide how much funding goes to NASA. So during the space race, obviously they would have, JFK and others would have had a lot more funding going to those independent agencies. Whenever it's a time period that they decide that it's not as important, they will reduce funding in that same way. Another example of the of that would be the Postal Service. Okay, so independent agency, again, it's not supposed to be political. It's supposed to carry out an essential function of the United States government. On the other hand, we do have some aspects to the United States government that that acts kind of similar to a business, and we call those government corporations. They operate obviously very similar to a business in that they make money, but they are run by the government and provide an essential service. such as the Amtrak Train Association. You're going to have different agencies and things like that that fall under that. The FDIC would be another example of a government corporation that controls, again, acts similar to a business, but is not necessarily run by an actual independent business. It's owned by the government. All right, the last one is going to be an independent regulatory agency and commissions. These are going to be not only different agencies that are separate from other cabinet branches, but they have some type of legislative, some type of judicial power. What I mean by that is, well, let's take an example. For instance, the FDA or the EPA or the Environmental Protection Agency are going to be made up of different experts in those fields that have been given authority by Congress and by the president to enforce environmental protection law. So they come up with some of the rules for enforcing the environment, so making sure that there's clean air and water and things like that. Congress and the president have decided that basically they're not experts in that field, and so they've given up some of their authority and delegated some of that authority to these independent regulatory agencies to carry out the law. And their goal is not only to come up with these laws, they also enforce them in such a way that they decide whether or not people are breaking the law. So the EPA oftentimes sends out agents or people to go and test these different businesses and corporations to make sure that they're meeting the qualifications that they came up with. And so they kind of act as a very independent and powerful agency that enforces these important laws. All right, so very similarly, you have the FDA that does that for the Food and Drug Administration. So they're the ones that are going out and testing the foods and making sure that they comply with all the laws, making sure there's not harmful chemicals or things of that nature in it, making sure that they meet all those requirements. So in a way, they get to have some autonomy in coming up with the policy issues, how that's going to be enforced, what the laws really look like. And they actually go out, test, and do all the things to make sure that people are kept safe and that people are following the laws. And so, again, they're independent in the sense that they're not part of any particular cabinet agency or department. And also, they get to regulate how that law gets carried out and have some leeway in coming up with what laws get created. So these are the three types of commissions. I want you to go ahead and think for yourself, some other examples that may fall into those categories. This, again, is a difficult concept a lot of time for students. So find and create a list of different agencies that would fall under these different corporations. Make sure you have some examples because that'll really help you out on the test. It's one of those tough concepts.